What if I told you that the safest home in the Smoky Mountains wasn't built with bricks or concrete, but inside a 400-year-old oak tree? After their own children sold the family house and left them behind, 78-year-old Harold and 76-year-old Eleanor disappeared into the forest. Everyone thought they had lost their minds. But when the worst storm in decades struck Tennessee, the hidden home they built became the only place standing between dozens of strangers and certain disaster. What they created inside that ancient tree would change an entire town forever. Late autumn fog drifted through the Great Smoky Mountains beneath a pale gray sky. Cold winds carried the scent of damp oak leaves and distant pine, while the ancient forest waited quietly for the first snowfall of winter. Harold Bennett had always believed that a man could survive almost anything except watching his family disappear one promise at a time. At 78 years old, he stood just over 6 feet tall, though age had gently curved his once straight posture. Years of carpentry and forestry work had left him with broad shoulders that still hinted at remarkable strength despite the stiffness in his joints. Thick silver hair framed a deeply weathered face marked by decades beneath the Tennessee sun, while a neatly trimmed white beard softened his strong jawline. His steel blue eyes had never lost their quiet determination, but they now carried the loneliness of someone who had spent too many evenings waiting for a knock that never came. His rough hands remained covered with calluses earned honestly over more than 50 years of building homes, repairing barns, and helping neighbors after storms. Everyone who had known Harold during his younger years described him the same way: dependable, patient, and generous to a fault. If someone's roof leaked, Harold appeared with his tools before sunrise. If an elderly neighbor struggled through winter, he quietly chopped their firewood without expecting thanks. Eleanor often joked that Harold trusted people far longer than people deserved. Even after disappointment, he found reasons to forgive. It was both his greatest strength and his deepest wound. Standing beside him in the nearly empty parking lot of a county storage facility was Eleanor Bennett, his 76-year-old wife, and the only person who had remained beside him through every season of life. Eleanor was 5 feet 4 with a graceful, slender frame that age had never managed to diminish. Her shoulder-length silver hair curled softly beneath a knitted wool hat, and kind hazel eyes reflected both intelligence and endless compassion. Fine lines surrounded her warm smile, though lately that smile appeared less often than Harold remembered. Years spent tending gardens, preserving vegetables, and caring for generations of family had left her hands small but remarkably capable. She possessed a quiet strength that rarely announced itself through words. Instead, she comforted people simply by sitting beside them. After 54 years of marriage, Eleanor could understand Harold's thoughts merely by watching the way he held his coffee cup or stared into the distance. Losing their home had broken something inside her, yet she refused to let Harold see how frightened she truly felt. Everything they still owned fit inside an aging green pickup truck. 3 suitcases, a cedar rocking chair Harold had built shortly after their wedding, 2 boxes of family photographs, several blankets, and Eleanor's worn Bible, its pages softened from decades of faithful reading. Their children had promised this arrangement would only be temporary. Their son, Michael Bennett, a successful financial consultant living in Nashville, insisted selling the old mountain house was the only practical solution after his business investments collapsed beneath overwhelming debt. 49 years old, neatly dressed, articulate, and always confident in front of clients, Michael had inherited Harold's intelligence, but not his patience. Years spent chasing promotions and larger opportunities gradually convinced him that every problem could be solved through money or efficiency. He loved his parents in the way busy people often believe they do, assuming intentions mattered more than time actually spent together. Standing beside him during the sale had been his younger sister, Rebecca Lawson, 46, an accomplished real estate agent whose polished appearance, fashionable clothes, and carefully chosen words often concealed deep anxiety about financial security. Rebecca genuinely believed moving her parents into the city would provide better health care and a more comfortable future. Neither sibling imagined their plan would end with weeks of silence. "We'll come back next Saturday," Michael had promised while hugging Eleanor outside the lawyer's office. Rebecca nodded. "Just stay at the motel a little longer. We're getting everything ready." Harold believed them. Why wouldn't he? Parents spend an entire lifetime believing their children mean what they say. The first Saturday passed. No phone call. The second brought only a brief text message apologizing for unexpected meetings. The third week arrived with complete silence. Harold never complained. Every morning, he quietly checked his phone before Eleanor woke, hoping he had simply missed a message during the night. Every evening, he placed the phone back into his pocket, pretending disappointment no longer hurt. Eleanor noticed anyway. One rainy afternoon, she gently rested her hand over his. "They're busy," she whispered. Harold forced a smile. "I know." But deep inside, he feared something far more painful than busyness. Perhaps their children had slowly begun believing their parents belonged somewhere else now. Several days later, the county social worker visited the motel. Her name was Lisa Morgan, a compassionate woman in her early 50s with short brown hair, thoughtful green eyes behind thin glasses, and an expression shaped by years of helping families through difficult seasons. She spoke gently, never sounding judgmental, and explained that a nearby assisted living facility still had 2 available rooms. "It's a wonderful place," Lisa assured them. "You'll have medical care, warm meals, and people around you every day." Harold thanked her sincerely. He knew she meant well. After Lisa left, Eleanor sat quietly beside the motel window, watching fog drift over the mountains. "I don't want strangers deciding when I wake up," she admitted softly. "I don't want our last memories to happen inside a hallway." Neither did Harold. Before sunrise the following morning, he loaded the truck without saying where they were going. 2 hours later, they turned onto an old gravel road that no longer appeared on most maps. The forest welcomed them with complete silence. Towering white oaks and sugar maples stretched toward the gray autumn sky exactly as Harold remembered from childhood. Every curve of the narrow trail awakened forgotten memories. Here he had learned to fish with his father. There he had carved his initials into a fallen log. Around the next bend stood the place that had filled countless childhood adventures. The giant white oak. More than 4 centuries old, its enormous trunk measured wider than a small cabin, while massive branches reached across the forest like protective arms. Time had hollowed part of its center naturally, without killing the tree. Harold remembered hiding inside that hollow as a 10-year-old boy whenever summer storms swept through the mountains. He stepped slowly toward the opening. The hollow remained, larger than he remembered, dry, protected, almost untouched. Eleanor looked from the ancient tree to her husband. "You can't be serious." Harold walked inside the hollow and rested one weathered hand against the living wood. He smiled for the first time in many weeks. "If God has kept this tree standing for over 400 years, he said quietly, maybe he's been saving a place for us all along." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. Then at the ancient oak. For the first time since losing everything, she saw hope standing where everyone else would have seen only an old tree. Winter settled quietly across the Great Smoky Mountains. Frost-coated fallen oak leaves each morning, and thin ribbons of smoke drifted between ancient trees as cold winds whispered through the silent forest. Harold Bennett never announced his plans aloud again. After showing Eleanor the hollow inside the giant white oak, he simply began working one piece at a time. At 78, his body no longer obeyed him as faithfully as it once had. Every swing of a hammer reminded him of aching shoulders. Every heavy board forced him to stop and catch his breath. Yet the years had not taken away what mattered most. His hands still remembered how to build. The abandoned family home had already been demolished after the sale, but before construction crews cleared the property completely, Harold quietly asked permission to collect whatever scraps no one wanted. Most workers assumed the old man simply couldn't bear throwing away memories. They never realized he was gathering the future. Over several weeks, he hauled weathered oak floorboards, sturdy wall studs, old cedar shelves, and the small kitchen window that Eleanor had looked through every morning for nearly half a century. Each piece carried tiny marks of family life, scratches left by grandchildren, faded pencil lines recording children's heights, dents from countless ordinary days that suddenly felt priceless. Harold refused to let those memories disappear into a landfill. Every board deserved another life. The ancient oak welcomed them one careful trip at a time. Its enormous hollow stretched deeper than Eleanor had imagined, naturally protected from rain by the living trunk surrounding it. Harold spent the first month doing nothing except cleaning. Fallen leaves that had collected over decades were removed by hand. Rotten wood was carefully cut away without harming the healthy living sections of the tree. He examined every curve of the interior the same way a craftsman studied an old cathedral. He never rushed. The tree had survived more than 400 years. It deserved patience. Eleanor watched quietly from a folding chair beside the entrance nearly every afternoon. At first she believed Harold was simply giving himself something to do so grief would not overwhelm him. But gradually she noticed something changing. For the first time since losing their home, he smiled while working. One afternoon she stepped inside the hollow carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The space already looked different. Harold had built a raised wooden floor that rested gently on adjustable supports instead of cutting into the living roots. Small shelves curved naturally along the inside walls, following the shape of the trunk rather than forcing straight lines where none belonged. "You've thought about this before," Eleanor whispered. Harold chuckled softly. "When I was 10, she laughed. "You've been planning this for almost 70 years. I just didn't know it." Every day, another small improvement appeared. The old kitchen window found a new place overlooking the eastern hillside, where morning sunlight filtered through the forest. A compact cast-iron wood stove, rescued from an abandoned hunting cabin with permission from its owner, warmed the interior without requiring large amounts of firewood. Using gutters fashioned from reclaimed copper roofing, Harold designed a simple rainwater collection system that directed clean mountain rain into covered storage barrels hidden naturally among nearby rocks and rhododendron bushes. Nothing disturbed the forest. Nothing announced that people lived there. Even the small solar panels came from a campground that had replaced its outdated equipment. After carefully repairing cracked wiring and worn connectors, Harold mounted them low among surrounding rocks where sunlight reached through the trees. From any distance beyond a few yards, they disappeared completely beneath moss and fallen branches. Inside, however, tiny lights glowed each evening. Enough electricity powered 2 LED lamps, a weather radio, and a small battery that Eleanor used to charge the hearing aids she depended on every day. The transformation amazed her. Outside, the ancient white oak looked exactly as it always had. Its weathered bark remained untouched. Towering branches stretched across the mountainside exactly as they had for centuries. Hikers walking nearby saw nothing except another magnificent old tree standing quietly in the forest. Inside, warm pine walls reflected soft lantern light. The little wood stove crackled gently. Handmade shelves held family photographs rescued from the old house. A narrow table built from Harold's former workbench stood beneath the window. For the first time in months, it felt like home again. One snowy evening, Eleanor slowly looked around the tiny room before resting her hand over Harold's. "I was afraid we'd spend the rest of our lives waiting for someone to save us." Harold squeezed her hand gently. Maybe God was only waiting for us to start building. Outside, the giant oak stood silently beneath the winter stars. No one passing through the mountains could have imagined that hidden inside one of Tennessee's oldest living trees, an abandoned couple had quietly begun rebuilding not only a home, but their hope. By early spring, the forest surrounding the giant white oak had begun waking from its long winter sleep. Dogwood blossoms opened beneath the towering branches. Wildflowers covered the mountain floor, and warm sunlight filtered through fresh green leaves, hiding countless quiet miracles from anyone passing along the old trail. Life inside the ancient tree settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every morning, Eleanor Bennett opened the small reclaimed window Harold had installed months earlier. Instead of looking across the porch of the home they had lost, she now watched deer wander through the mist while cardinals perched on nearby branches singing before sunrise. She baked simple biscuits on the cast-iron stove, tended a tiny herb garden growing outside among moss-covered stones, and carefully embroidered new curtains from old linen she had saved years before. The little home felt impossibly small, yet somehow it carried more peace than the large house they had once struggled to keep. Harold continued improving the hidden shelter whenever the weather allowed. He built a narrow bookshelf that perfectly followed the curve of the living trunk. He crafted 2 folding chairs that disappeared neatly beneath the handmade table. Using fallen chestnut logs collected after winter storms, he created hidden storage benches so every inch of the tiny space served a purpose. His years as a carpenter allowed him to solve problems that younger builders might never have considered. Most importantly, he refused to damage the tree itself. Every beam rested against independent wooden supports instead of being nailed into the living trunk. Air flowed naturally around the interior, allowing the ancient oak to continue growing undisturbed. "It's still the owner," Harold often reminded Eleanor. "We're only grateful guests." Outside the forest, however, people noticed something unusual. Nearly every afternoon, the elderly couple could be seen slowly pulling small wagons loaded with reclaimed lumber, firewood, blankets, or old furniture into the woods behind their former property. Curiosity quickly became gossip. Some neighbors shook their heads sympathetically. Others laughed openly. "They've finally lost their minds. I heard they're building something underground." "No," another replied. "Someone told me they're trying to live inside that old oak." The story spread through the nearby mountain town faster than Harold ever imagined. He heard the whispers whenever he visited the hardware store for screws or waterproof sealant. He simply smiled politely and continued loading his supplies. Explaining would have changed nothing. One Saturday afternoon, another unfamiliar pickup stopped near the forest entrance. Stepping out was Ethan Cole, a 32-year-old outdoor YouTuber whose channel featured abandoned cabins, forgotten Appalachian history, and unusual stories hidden throughout the Smoky Mountains. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with a lean build, Ethan had short, dark blonde hair beneath a charcoal baseball cap, light stubble framing a friendly face, and bright blue eyes constantly searching for stories that mixed mystery with human emotion. Unlike many online creators who chased controversy, Ethan genuinely loved documenting forgotten places, though years competing for viewers had taught him that unusual headlines attracted attention far faster than quiet truths. He introduced himself respectfully. "I've been hearing stories about an elderly couple carrying furniture into the woods." Harold chuckled. "People around here always enjoy a good story. Would you mind if I filmed a little?" Harold glanced toward Eleanor. She nodded gently. "As long as you don't follow us too far." Ethan respected the request. He never discovered the hidden entrance inside the giant oak. Instead, he filmed Harold pulling reclaimed lumber along the trail, Eleanor carrying flower pots toward the forest, and the two of them disappearing among ancient trees before returning hours later, smiling more brightly than anyone expected from people who had supposedly lost everything. Back home, Ethan edited the footage into a short documentary. Wanting something playful rather than cruel, he titled it, "The Old Couple Who Thinks They Live Inside a Tree." Within hours, the video spread across social media. Thousands became millions. Comments poured in from across America. "Someone should help them. This breaks my heart. Maybe they're happier than the rest of us. I want to know what's hidden in those woods." Harold and Eleanor watched the video together several days later using their small solar-powered tablet. Eleanor looked worried. "Do you think they'll come looking?" Harold closed the screen and smiled quietly. People are usually interested in stories. He looked toward the ancient oak surrounding them. They rarely noticed the truth standing right in front of them. Outside, spring birds continued singing across the mountains. Tourists occasionally stopped along the roadside hoping to glimpse the mysterious elderly couple everyone online was talking about. They searched the forest for a strange little house. They searched the hills for signs of hidden construction. No one ever thought to look inside the oldest living tree in the Smoky Mountains. Because from the outside, it still looked exactly like every other ancient oak that had quietly watched generations come and go. Heavy snow clouds swallowed the peaks of the Great Smoky Mountains as winter tightened its grip across eastern Tennessee. Freezing winds roared through ancient forests while the first flakes drifted silently onto trails that would soon disappear beneath the storm. Almost 9 months had passed since Harold Bennett and Eleanor Bennett quietly disappeared into the ancient white oak. Outside the forest, people still talked about the strange elderly couple from Ethan Cole's viral video. Some believed they had built a tiny cabin somewhere deep in the mountains. Others insisted the entire story had been exaggerated for the internet. Harold never corrected anyone. The forest had taught him long ago that not every truth needed an audience. Life inside the giant oak followed a peaceful rhythm. Each morning, Harold checked the weather instruments he had mounted outside beneath a small wooden shelter hidden among rhododendron bushes. During his younger years as a volunteer ranger assisting the Tennessee Forestry Service after storms, he had learned to recognize dangerous weather long before television forecasts became urgent. Falling air pressure, restless birds, and the unusual silence that settled across the mountains all warned him that something serious was approaching. One icy afternoon, the old weather radio crackled to life. National Weather Service has upgraded the winter storm warning to a blizzard emergency. Snowfall may exceed 30 inches. Travel strongly discouraged. Power outages expected throughout the Smoky Mountains. Harold slowly lowered the volume. He looked toward Eleanor. This won't be an ordinary storm. She immediately recognized the expression on his face. It was the same one she had seen decades earlier whenever hurricanes reached Tennessee after crossing the Gulf or when mountain floods threatened isolated communities. Without wasting a single minute, they began preparing. Harold carried extra firewood from the covered storage racks he had built beneath nearby rock overhangs. Eleanor filled every water barrel connected to the rain collection system, baked fresh loaves of bread, simmered vegetable soup inside the cast-iron stove, and carefully organized blankets along the sleeping loft Harold had completed only weeks before. They counted jars of preserved vegetables, dried beans, smoked venison, and homemade apple preserves stored neatly beneath the floor. They had enough supplies for weeks, not because they feared the future, because years of mountain life had taught them preparation was another way of showing gratitude. Snow arrived before sunrise. By noon, the forest had vanished behind sheets of blowing white. The narrow mountain road disappeared completely beneath deep drifts, while thick ice snapped power lines across nearby valleys. Towering pines bent beneath the weight of heavy snow, and even the ancient white oak groaned softly as fierce winds pushed against its massive crown. Harold stood quietly at the small window watching the storm. The great tree barely moved. Its enormous roots, buried beneath centuries of mountain soil, absorbed every violent gust with patient strength. It has survived hundreds of winters, he whispered. It knows what to do better than we do. Late that afternoon, distant sounds drifted through the howling wind. Not animals. Voices. Faint. Scattered. Harold immediately opened the hidden observation hatch near the entrance. Several figures stumbled slowly through the snow only a few hundred yards away. Some wore bright hiking jackets. Others wrapped themselves in emergency blankets. One person appeared to be supporting someone who could barely walk. Harold felt his heartbeat quicken. Eleanor joined him beside the entrance. Lost hikers, or travelers who left the highway. He watched another burst of wind nearly knock one woman to the ground. Without another word, Harold reached for his heavy wool coat. Eleanor gently caught his arm. "If you open the entrance." He nodded. "They'll know." She looked around the tiny home they had built with their own hands. The photographs, the little stove, the warm wooden walls, everything they had protected in secret. Then she looked back toward the struggling strangers disappearing into the blizzard. Her answer came quietly. "This home was never meant to save only us." Harold smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." He pulled back the cleverly concealed wooden panel hidden inside the hollow trunk. For the first time since completing the secret home, the ancient white oak opened its door to someone besides the two people who had built it. Harold stepped into the blinding snow and raised an old kerosene lantern high above his head. Its golden light pierced the white darkness. The struggling travelers stopped. One by one, they turned toward the impossible glow coming from what appeared to be the middle of an ancient tree. None of them could yet imagine that hidden inside one of the oldest living oaks in Tennessee waited enough warmth, food, and hope to carry far more people through the storm than Harold and Eleanor had ever planned for. The blizzard raged without mercy through the first night. Wind screamed across the ridges at nearly 70 miles an hour, piling snow against abandoned cabins and burying mountain roads beneath drifts taller than pickup trucks. Throughout the Smoky Mountains, electricity disappeared one community after another. Emergency radio broadcasts repeated the same warning. Rescue crews could not reach many isolated areas until the storm weakened. The group Harold Bennett had guided toward the ancient oak struggled through waist-deep snow, shielding their faces against freezing wind. One by one, they stepped through the concealed entrance and stopped in complete disbelief. The impossible home hidden inside the living tree glowed with warm lantern light. The cast-iron stove radiated steady heat. Fresh bread filled the air with its comforting aroma. Wooden shelves lined the curved interior walls, holding carefully organized food, blankets, first aid supplies, and family photographs that transformed the strange shelter into something unmistakably human. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, a little girl whispered, "We're inside the tree." Harold smiled gently. For a little while. Among the exhausted travelers was Daniel Mercer, a 43-year-old park ranger from Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Standing just over 6 feet tall with a broad athletic build shaped by 2 decades of mountain rescue work. Daniel had short dark hair sprinkled with early gray around his temples and a thick beard now covered with melting snow. His weathered face carried the calm confidence of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions in dangerous situations, yet beneath that confidence lived quiet guilt. 5 years earlier, he had lost a fellow ranger during a sudden winter avalanche, a tragedy that made him obsessively protective whenever visitors became trapped in severe weather. Daniel removed his frozen gloves and stared around the shelter. "I've patrolled these mountains for 21 years, he said softly. "I never knew this place existed." "It wasn't meant to," Harold replied. The stranded group included families returning from Gatlinburg, 2 elderly hikers who had underestimated the approaching storm, 3 college students whose vehicle had slid into a ditch, and a young married couple traveling home after visiting relatives. One elderly man shivered uncontrollably despite wearing several heavy coats. Eleanor immediately wrapped another wool blanket around his shoulders before handing him a steaming bowl of vegetable soup. "No one stays cold while we're here," she said with a gentle smile. Without discussing it, everyone naturally found ways to help. The younger travelers carried additional firewood from Harold's covered storage area whenever the wind briefly eased. The college students melted clean snow for washing dishes. Parents comforted frightened children gathered near the crackling stove. Daniel inspected the tree's interior carefully, expecting to find signs that the storm might threaten its stability. Instead, he found remarkable craftsmanship. Every support beam stood independently from the living trunk. The structure flexed gently without placing dangerous pressure on the tree itself. The massive oak absorbed each violent gust much the way a ship rode powerful ocean waves. Late that evening, another tremendous blast of wind echoed through the mountains. The ancient oak creaked deeply. Several children looked upward in fear. Daniel quietly stepped outside with Harold carrying powerful flashlights. Snow swirled around them almost horizontally. Nearby, they discovered 2 modern vacation cabins with sections of roofing already torn away. One large pine had crashed directly through another home's front porch. Harold pointed upward. The giant white oak still stood proudly against the storm. Its enormous branches bent with the wind instead of resisting it, while roots that had anchored themselves for more than 4 centuries held firm beneath frozen ground. Daniel slowly shook his head. Modern houses fight the mountain. He looked back at the ancient tree. This one learned how to live with it. For 3 long days, the blizzard trapped everyone inside the hidden home. The little shelter somehow accommodated 23 people without panic or complaint. Stories replaced fear. Children laughed while Harold carved tiny wooden animals from leftover cedar scraps. Eleanor taught families how to bake simple biscuits over the cast-iron stove. Complete strangers who had entered frightened gradually began feeling like neighbors gathered around one shared table. When the skies finally cleared, National Guard vehicles and rescue crews slowly reopened the mountain roads. The rescued families stepped outside, blinking beneath brilliant winter sunshine. Before leaving, nearly everyone turned back toward the giant oak. They no longer saw an old hollow tree. They saw the place that had kept them alive. Daniel stood beside Harold before climbing into a rescue vehicle. "I've spent my career believing the safest shelters were built with concrete and steel." He reached out and firmly shook Harold's weathered hand. "You've just proven that wisdom sometimes grows from roots older than all of us." As the last vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, silence returned to the forest once again. Only the ancient oak remained standing exactly where it always had. But this time, its greatest secret no longer belonged only to Harold and Eleanor. The first signs of spring returned quietly to the Great Smoky Mountains. Melting snow fed crystal-clear streams beneath towering oaks, while warm sunlight filtered through fresh green leaves, revealing a forest that had survived another winter with quiet dignity. The extraordinary rescue inside the ancient white oak spread far beyond eastern Tennessee. Newspapers called it a miracle. Television stations described it as the hidden treehouse that saved 23 lives. Ethan Cole's original video resurfaced online, now accompanied by footage from survivors who described the impossible shelter hidden inside a living tree. Thousands of people who had once laughed at the elderly couple suddenly wanted to know whether the story was real. Harold Bennett ignored almost every interview request. He and Eleanor returned to the same peaceful routine they had followed before the blizzard. Every morning they swept the wooden floor, collected rainwater, split firewood, and welcomed birds that nested among the giant oak's enormous branches. Fame never interested Harold. To him, the greatest reward had already arrived the moment every frightened stranger walked safely back down the mountain. Several weeks later, however, a group of official vehicles slowly climbed the old forest road. This time the visitors carried measuring equipment instead of television cameras. Leading the team was Dr. Benjamin Carter, a 62-year-old forest structural engineer from the University of Tennessee, whose career had focused on preserving historic trees throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Standing just under 6 feet tall with a lean frame and long, deliberate movements, Benjamin possessed neatly combed silver hair, a closely trimmed gray beard, and intelligent amber eyes that seemed to study every detail before speaking. Decades of climbing ancient forests had left his hands rough despite his academic career, while a climbing scar across his left forearm reminded him of a research accident many years earlier when an old hemlock collapsed beneath him. The experience had made him exceptionally cautious and deeply respectful of living trees. Rather than treating forests as collections of timber, Benjamin believed every ancient tree represented a historical document written by nature itself. After introducing himself, Benjamin looked toward the towering white oak with unmistakable admiration. "I've studied Appalachian oaks for 35 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen one quite like this." Harold smiled. "She's older than both of us." Benjamin spent hours examining the tree without entering the hidden home. His team measured trunk diameter, mapped root spread using ground-penetrating radar, inspected bark health, and carefully collected tiny wood samples only from naturally fallen branches. Only after completing the external survey did Harold invite them inside. The researchers entered respectfully. Silence filled the hollow. Instead of finding a damaged tree barely supporting a wooden cabin, Benjamin discovered something completely unexpected. The ancient trunk remained alive. Healthy sap still flowed beneath the outer layers of wood. New growth rings continued forming every year. Most astonishing of all, the small home inside had never been attached directly to the living structure. Every floor beam rested upon an independent wooden framework carefully designed to distribute weight onto the ground rather than the tree itself. Small ventilation gaps allowed air to circulate naturally, preventing trapped moisture from causing decay. Benjamin slowly removed his glasses. "This wasn't an accident." Harold nodded. "No." The old carpenter walked toward one corner where an even older timber supported part of the independent frame. "My grandfather built this section." Benjamin looked surprised. "He did." Harold gently brushed dust from the weathered beam. "More than 70 years ago." As a young boy, Harold had watched his grandfather, Elijah Bennett, spend several summers working inside the giant oak after discovering lightning damage had opened part of its hollow center. Rather than cutting the tree down, Elijah, who had learned traditional Appalachian timber framing techniques from his own father, believed the oak deserved to be preserved. Using handcrafted white oak beams joined with wooden pegs instead of large iron spikes, Elijah built an internal support frame that strengthened weakened sections without restricting the tree's natural growth. He carefully removed only dead wood, leaving every living layer untouched. The structure worked almost like a protective skeleton hidden inside the trunk. "My grandfather always said," Harold recalled softly, "never force a tree to carry what the earth can carry for it." Benjamin knelt to examine one of the original wooden joints. The craftsmanship astonished him. Modern engineering principles described exactly the same concept using different language. Yet Elijah Bennett had accomplished it generations earlier with little more than practical wisdom and deep respect for nature. Benjamin finally stood, looking around the warm little home with quiet admiration. "This tree isn't surviving because someone conquered nature." He smiled toward Harold. "It's surviving because your grandfather understood how to work with it." For several long moments, nobody spoke. Outside, sunlight filtered through 400 years of living branches. Inside, Harold suddenly realized that what his grandfather had quietly built decades earlier was never simply a hiding place. It was a lesson, one that the world was only now beginning to understand. News about the ancient white oak traveled far beyond Tennessee during the following months. What began as a remarkable rescue story slowly became something much larger. Forestry journals published articles about the mysterious living shelter. Universities contacted Dr. Benjamin Carter requesting permission to study the unusual structure. Architects wanted to understand how a 400-year-old tree could remain healthy while safely enclosing a livable space. Harold Bennett answered every letter with the same polite response. "You're welcome to learn. But remember, you're visiting the tree's home before you're visiting mine." Soon the quiet mountain trail welcomed visitors from places Harold and Eleanor had never imagined. Graduate students from the University of Tennessee carefully documented Elijah Bennett's traditional Appalachian timber frame techniques. Forestry professors compared growth rings, moisture levels, and structural flexibility with other ancient white oaks throughout the region. Conservation specialists concluded that Elijah's ingenious support system had never attempted to overpower the tree. Instead, it allowed the living trunk to continue growing naturally while gently protecting weakened sections from further collapse. Their research attracted even more attention. Families hiking through the Smoky Mountains asked local guides about the miracle oak. Photographers waited patiently for sunrise to capture the towering tree rising through mountain fog. History teachers brought students to explain how older generations often solve problems by working alongside nature instead of trying to dominate it. Harold welcomed every visitor with quiet kindness. He never charged admission. He never placed donation boxes outside. He never allowed souvenir shops or commercial signs near the forest. One afternoon, a black luxury SUV arrived at the trailhead. Stepping out was Richard Calloway, a 58-year-old luxury resort developer from Atlanta. Standing nearly 6 feet 2 with an athletic build maintained through disciplined routines, Richard wore an expensive tailored field jacket over polished hiking boots that had clearly seen very little actual hiking. His silver-black hair was perfectly styled, and his clean-shaven face reflected years of confidence earned in boardrooms rather than forests. Sharp gray eyes constantly measured opportunity, while his calm voice revealed someone accustomed to negotiating million-dollar projects. Decades earlier, Richard had grown up in a poor Appalachian family before building one of the Southeast's largest ecotourism companies. Although he sincerely admired beautiful places, years of commercial success had gradually convinced him that every remarkable location could become an even greater attraction with enough investment. After touring the tree in respectful silence, Richard turned toward Harold. "This could become one of the most famous destinations in America." Harold smiled politely. It already became what it needed to become. Richard opened a leather folder containing architectural sketches. "We could build elevated walkways, a visitor center, luxury cabins. Preserve the tree while creating jobs for the whole county." He slid another document across the table. The purchase offer contained more money than Harold and Eleanor had seen in their entire lives. Richard continued, "You'd never have to worry about another bill again." Eleanor quietly looked toward Harold. She knew exactly what he was remembering. The day they had lost their first home because people believed money mattered more than memories. Harold slowly closed the folder without reading beyond the first page. "I'm grateful for your generosity." Richard waited. "But the answer is no." The developer looked genuinely surprised. "May I ask why?" Harold walked to the entrance of the giant oak. Outside, an elderly hiking couple rested on a nearby bench after climbing the mountain trail. A young family shared sandwiches beneath the branches while their children laughed chasing butterflies. Near the stream, 2 backpackers filled water bottles before continuing their journey. All of them had stopped because someone told them they would find a place where they could rest safely. Harold smiled softly. "They're already paying." Richard frowned. "I don't understand." "They pay every time they leave here believing the world is a kinder place than they thought yesterday." For several moments, neither man spoke. Richard slowly folded the contract and placed it back inside his briefcase. "I think I spent too many years building destinations." He looked around the peaceful forest and forgot what a home actually feels like. Before leaving, he quietly thanked Harold for refusing his offer. As spring turned into summer, the hidden home became known throughout the Smoky Mountains not as a tourist attraction, but as a place of refuge. Elderly hikers knew they could always stop for warm tea and conversation. Families displaced by floods or storms found temporary shelter without ever being asked for payment. Long-distance hikers often discovered a hot meal waiting after difficult days on the trail. Whenever someone thanked Harold for opening his home to strangers, he simply rested one hand against the ancient white oak and smiled. A home becomes real the moment someone feels safe inside it. The old tree remained silent. But somehow, everyone who stepped through its hidden doorway understood exactly what he meant. 3 gentle springs had passed since the blizzard that forever changed the story of the ancient white oak. Morning mist still drifted through the great Smoky Mountains, but now it carried the laughter of visitors, birdsong, and the quiet rhythm of a place that had become a symbol of hope instead of mystery. Harold Bennett often smiled whenever strangers called the giant oak the heart of the Smokies. To him, it had never been famous. It had simply been home. Life settled into a peaceful pattern neither Harold nor Eleanor had ever imagined during those lonely weeks after losing everything. Every Saturday morning, hikers stopped beneath the spreading branches to rest before continuing their journey through the mountains. School children arrived with notebooks, listening as park rangers explained how one ancient tree had survived more than 4 centuries because generations of people had chosen to protect it instead of exploit it. Elderly couples often lingered longest, sitting quietly beneath the shade while Eleanor poured fresh coffee and homemade apple pie onto the weathered wooden table Harold had built decades earlier in their first family home. The mountain community slowly decided they wanted to repay the kindness the Bennetts had shown everyone else. No one announced a fundraising campaign. No newspaper organized it. Instead, donations quietly appeared. A retired carpenter contributed reclaimed timber. Local masons volunteered weekends laying stone foundations. Electricians installed wiring without charging $1. Children filled mason jars with coins collected from lemonade stands. Restaurant owners delivered hot meals to every volunteer working on the project. Before autumn arrived, a modest but beautiful mountain cottage stood only 50 yards from the ancient oak. Built from native stone and locally harvested timber, the little house overlooked the same valley Harold had watched since childhood. Large windows welcomed the morning sun, while a wide front porch faced the old tree that had once sheltered 23 frightened strangers through the worst storm in decades. When the community gathered to hand Harold the key, he stood speechless. Finally, he looked around at the smiling faces. "We already had a home," he said quietly. An elderly neighbor smiled. "We know. We're just making sure you have too." Laughter echoed beneath the great oak. Harold and Eleanor moved a few of their belongings into the new cottage. Yet every Friday evening, just before sunset, they followed the familiar forest path carrying only a lantern, a kettle of tea, and Eleanor's old Bible. Every weekend, they slept inside the giant tree. Some habits belong to the soul more than the body. One quiet October afternoon, nearly 6 years after selling the family house, an unfamiliar SUV slowly stopped outside the cottage. Harold recognized it immediately. Michael Bennett stepped out first. He looked older than his 55 years. His expensive suits had disappeared, replaced by simple jeans and a plain flannel shirt. The confidence that once defined his posture had been replaced by hesitation. Deep circles rested beneath tired blue eyes, and the neatly styled businessman Harold remembered now carried the weary expression of someone who had spent years discovering that success meant very little without peace. Rebecca Lawson followed a few moments later. Her fashionable appearance had softened into something simpler and more genuine. Fine lines surrounded her hazel eyes, while tears appeared before she spoke a single word. Years of chasing financial security had ended with a failed marriage and a career that no longer brought satisfaction. Losing contact with her parents had become the greatest regret of her life. Neither child knew where to begin. Michael lowered his eyes. "Dad," his voice broke. "I'm sorry." Rebecca quietly wiped away tears. "We kept telling ourselves we'd come back next month. Then next year. And eventually." She could not finish. Harold looked at both of them for a long moment. He saw older faces. More sorrow. Less pride. He remembered every birthday they had celebrated together. Every scraped knee he had bandaged. Every Christmas morning. Love had never disappeared. It had only been buried beneath years of mistakes. Without saying another word, Harold turned toward the forest. Come with me. The four of them followed the familiar trail beneath towering oaks until they reached the ancient tree. Harold opened the hidden wooden door. Michael and Rebecca froze. The warm little home remained almost exactly as it had years before. The old cast-iron stove, family photographs, Eleanor's curtains, and standing quietly beneath the window, the same wooden table rescued from the house they had sold, for chairs still surrounded it. Harold rested one weathered hand across its smooth surface. This table survived because I couldn't bear to leave it behind. He looked gently at his children. It waited longer than I ever expected. Silence filled the tiny room. Michael slowly pulled out one of the empty chairs. Rebecca sat beside her mother exactly where she had during countless family dinners as a little girl. Tears quietly rolled down Eleanor's cheeks. Harold finally spoke. A family isn't held together by walls. He looked around the little room built inside a living tree. It's held together by the people who choose to come home. No one answered. Words were no longer necessary. Outside, autumn sunlight filtered through 400 years of living branches. Years later, visitors no longer spoke first about the elderly couple abandoned by their children. They spoke about the giant white oak that had sheltered strangers during a terrible storm. They spoke about forgiveness offered without conditions. They spoke about neighbors who built a home for people who had once lost everything. Most of all, they remembered that the strongest home in the Smoky Mountains had never been built from stone, brick, or steel. It had been built from faith, compassion, second chances, and the quiet courage to keep loving even after your heart had been broken. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles are not the ones that fall from the sky. Sometimes, they grow quietly through faithful hearts that refuse to give up. A forgotten tree, a broken family, a simple act of kindness. In God's hands, even the places the world calls worthless can become shelters of hope for countless others. Harold believed he was building a home inside an ancient oak. But perhaps God was building something far greater inside Harold, a heart that could still forgive after being abandoned, still welcome strangers after losing everything, and still believe that love is stronger than disappointment. That is how miracles often begin, not with power or wealth, but with ordinary people choosing compassion when they have every reason not to. Every day, someone around us may be carrying a hidden burden, an elderly neighbor waiting for a visit, a parent hoping for one more phone call, a lonely stranger searching for a place to belong. We may never know whose life can be changed by a kind word, an open door, or a forgiving heart. Perhaps today, God is inviting us to become the safe place someone else has been praying to find. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We would love to hear your story. And if you believe that kindness, forgiveness, and faith can still change lives, please subscribe to the channel and become part of our growing community. May God bless you, your family, your home, and every path you walk. May He fill your heart with peace, strengthen you through every storm, and remind you that no matter how alone you may feel, His love is always preparing a place of hope for you. God bless you always. Amen.